Hello, everyone. My name is Michelle Rinehart, and I'm an Employer Services Manager here at Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, which we refer to as OOD. Today, I'm co-hosting with my colleague, Julie Wood, and we'd like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Retaining a Qualified Workforce, Part 2, Acquiring a Disability. Julie, will you please introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Michelle, and hello, everyone. My name is Julie Wood, and I am OOD's Worksite Accessibility Specialist. I'm also an occupational therapist and a certified ADA coordinator. In my role, I provide education for employers that is focused on creating inclusive and accessible workplaces. This includes discussing the guidelines under Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. It includes identifying ideas to consider for reasonable accommodations and sharing best practices and guidance for making the workplace accessible.
Thank you, Julie. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that today's training comes with a helpful learner's guide, which can be accessed now through the link that's posted in the Q&A section here in Microsoft Teams. Just as a reminder, the information we share in these resources and during today's conversation is for educational purposes only and is not legal advice, but we do hope you find this information is helpful. Also, OOD does not endorse products, services, or vendors. However, we will share examples throughout the webinar to illustrate possible solutions and resources for reasonable accommodations. We'll be stopping about halfway through today's presentation, and again before we conclude to answer questions, so please post your questions in the Q&A section at any time throughout the presentation so they're ready for us when we stop. Julie, would you like to address the accessibility practices we've included in today's webinar?
Sure. We plan for accessibility from the start. For example, we use the accessibility checker that is built into Microsoft 365 to review the learner's guide in PowerPoint. We address color contrast, font style and size, and add alternative text, known as alt text, to visual images. Also, in our delivery, Michelle and I mention each other by name as the conversation between us goes back and forth to indicate who is speaking. This can be helpful when attendees are receiving this information through services like American Sign Language interpretation and live captioning. After the webinar, we edit the transcript and fix any captioning errors before uploading the webinar to our on-demand library. We also include a reasonable accommodation statement in our invitation to the webinar, so if attendees need an accommodation, they know who to contact. Taking these steps up front can make this presentation more accessible and inclusive for everyone.
Thank you, Julie. We are excited to have everyone back together for the second webinar in our two-part series focused on retaining a qualified workforce, including retaining employees who acquire a disability after they're employed.
Michelle, in this series, we are discussing how to create workplaces that are inclusive and accessible for employees who acquire a disability, which means they were not born with a disability, but developed one during their lifetime, such as after employment has begun. This may occur because of the aging process or through an injury, an accident, or the onset of an illness or medical condition. We know that most disabilities are acquired after the age of 16. This means many people are employed before the onset of their disability. It's important for employees who acquire a disability during their employment to have access to what they need to remain in the workplace and feel included. So, employers who make efforts to include employees who acquire disabilities in their inclusion efforts will be well positioned to retain this valuable workforce.
Julie, the first webinar in the series focused on retaining employees who age into a disability. Today's webinar is focused on retaining employees who acquire a disability through an injury, accident, or onset of a medical condition.
Michelle, that's right, and we will begin with a discussion on acquiring a disability that includes helpful statistics and the benefits of retaining a qualified workforce. Then we will address when an acquired condition rises to the level of a disability under the ADA. We will talk about common limitations that may accompany an acquired disability and provide examples of effective, reasonable accommodations to enable employees who acquire a disability to continue to perform their job's essential functions. And we will conclude with resources employers can use to foster a workplace culture that is inclusive of employees who acquire a disability during employment.
Julie, you uncovered some statistics related to disability and acquiring a disability that I think are helpful in illustrating the importance of making sure employers' efforts to create disability inclusive cultures address this population of the workforce too.
Michelle, Colleen Boyle, who is a director at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, known as the CDC, was quoted as saying, "At some point in their lives, most people will either have a disability or know someone who has one." Her statement is based on the statistic from the CDC, which states 1 in 4 adults in our country have some type of disability that impacts major life activities. Colleen continues to say, learning more about people with disabilities can help us better understand and meet their needs. The Office of Disability Employment Policy, known as ODEP, shared that each year, millions of American workers experience an injury or illness that puts them at risk of leaving the workforce. Many are work-related, however, many more are off-the-job incidents. A resource from the Council for Disability Awareness shared that 1 in 4 20-year-olds can expect to have a condition that results in a long-term disability that keeps them out of the workforce for at least a year before they reach traditional retirement age. And approximately 5% of working Americans will experience a short-term disability, which is 6 months or less, related to an illness, injury, or pregnancy.
Julie, these statistics certainly do support the importance of establishing inclusive cultures that focus on retaining qualified employees who acquire a disability. Are there any commonalities to the type of conditions, limitations, and disabilities employees may acquire?
Michelle, acquiring a disability can result from an accident, an injury, or the onset of an illness or medical condition. The limitations can cross all disability types. I'll share some information I found. A CDC report from 2016 indicates the most common disability type is related to mobility, followed next by disabilities that impact cognition. They describe a mobility disability as a serious difficulty walking or climbing stairs, and a cognitive disability as a serious difficulty concentrating, remembering, or making decisions. According to the Council for Disability Awareness, causes of short-term disability can include musculoskeletal disorders that affect the back and spine, knees, hips, shoulders, and other body parts. Also digestive disorders, such as a hiatal hernia and gastritis, injuries such as fractures, sprains, and strains, and mental health conditions like depression and anxiety. Causes of long-term disability can include musculoskeletal disorders, cancer, fractures, sprains, and strains, mental health conditions, and circulatory conditions such as a heart attack and stroke.
Julie, you're right. An acquired disability can impact all types of disabilities. Let's talk about the impact on the workplace and what employers can do. The Northeast ADA Center has a small business toolkit that offers many helpful resources. They share that retaining talented and qualified employees gives small businesses a competitive advantage by avoiding turnover costs.
Michelle, that's likely due to the direct and indirect costs employers incur when they need to replace valuable workers. Direct costs relate to the hiring process, like recruiting, interviewing, and onboarding. Indirect costs relate to the time it takes for a new employee to be fully trained and productive on the job, and can include other employees putting their work on hold to assist the new employee with their job's essential functions. Again, we see the importance of disability inclusion being applied to retaining the talents of qualified employees who acquire a disability during their employment. One way employers can do this is to review their policies and procedures to ensure they're focused on retaining qualified employees who acquire disabilities. We will share resources to support this toward the end of this webinar. Another way employers can foster this inclusive culture is to provide accommodations for employees. According to the toolkit you referenced, Michelle, In almost every case, it costs far less to provide an accommodation than to incur the cost of losing a valuable qualified employee.
Julie, that's right. And we'll be sharing many examples of reasonable accommodations today. Before we do, let's clarify what we mean by disability. In our statistics, we've mentioned short-term and long-term disability. These can be determined and impacted by other laws. Our focus in this webinar is on Title I of the ADA. So when does a condition or limitation a person acquires become a disability under the ADA?
Michelle, that's a great question because not all conditions or limitations rise to the level of being a disability under the ADA. And the ADA's definition varies from how other entities and laws define disability. A person is considered under the ADA to have a disability when the person has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity, has a record of such an impairment, or is regarded as having such an impairment. So a person who acquires a condition may qualify as having a disability when the condition makes it more difficult to participate in major life activities like performing manual tasks, seeing, hearing, walking, lifting, breathing, concentrating, communicating, and working. Although the ADA does not have a list of medical conditions that automatically qualify a person as having a disability, their guidance does provide examples of conditions that should be easily concluded to be a disability. Some of these include deafness and blindness, partially or completely missing limbs, mobility impairments, cancer, diabetes, and post-traumatic stress disorder.
Julie, could a condition that is short-term be a disability under the ADA? I'm thinking of conditions like long COVID, a broken leg, or a workers' compensation injury. Or what about conditions that have periods of exacerbation and then go into remission?
Michelle, I'll answer by first sharing some history. The Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990. In 2008, the ADA Amendments Act was signed into law. During the years between the two, the U.S. Supreme Court was ruling with a narrow interpretation of disability, which was not aligned with the spirit of the ADA as intended by Congress when the ADA was initially passed. The Amendments Act provided greater protection from discrimination based on disability, and I'll share a few highlights of how the Act did so. The definition of disability under the ADA states an individual must have an impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. According to a resource from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, their guidance had initially defined substantially limits as significantly restricted. So the Amendments Act removed this definition and instead provided rules of instruction to explain how to determine if a person has a substantial limitation with a major life activity.
Julie, how do the rules of instruction apply to conditions that may fluctuate between severity level of symptoms and limitations?
Michelle, what the Amendments Act changed is when a person has limitations that are episodic, which means they come and go, or that go into remission, meaning they decrease or disappear, the limitations will be considered as if they are active. In this case, the decision of whether the person has a disability is based on whether a substantial limitation to a major life activity exists when the condition is active. The Job Accommodation Network, known as JAN, offers examples of conditions that may be episodic or go into remission, such as epilepsy, cancer, hypertension, diabetes, asthma, and bipolar disorder.
Julie, so the decision of whether a disability exists is based on the degree of limitation when the condition is active. That makes sense. Okay, how do the rules of instruction apply to temporary limitations?
Michelle, just like there is not a list of conditions that automatically qualify a person as having a disability, there is also not an automatic length of time a limitation must last to be considered a disability. The duration of the limitation is only one factor to consider when determining whether a disability exists. Now, according to Jan, impairments that last for a short time are customarily not covered under the ADA. However, they may be if during this period the limitation is sufficiently severe. For example, conditions like a broken leg and appendicitis or the common cold generally are not disabilities. But if a broken leg takes significantly longer to heal and causes a substantial limitation with walking, the condition could be considered a disability. Jan provides an example of a limitation related to a back impairment that causes a lifting restriction for several months. This could result in a substantial limitation of the major life activity of lifting, even if the impairment is not expected to be permanent.
Julie, that example brings me back to my question about whether a workers' compensation injury is considered a disability under the ADA.
Michelle, earlier when we defined disability under the ADA, we indicated that the ADA's definition is different from other entities and laws, and that includes workers' compensation. Having a workers' compensation injury does not automatically mean an individual has a disability under the ADA. The EEOC offers guidance on the interaction between Title I of the ADA and workers' compensation laws, which may help employers with the questions they have under both laws. This guidance addresses disability-related questions, the hiring process, return to work decisions, reasonable accommodations, and light-duty positions.
Julie, the guidance from the EEOC sounds like a great resource. Later, we'll share resources employers can access from Ohio's Bureau of Workers' Compensation to help further. When we discuss temporary limitations, you mentioned conditions like the common cold generally do not rise to the level of being a disability. But what about people experiencing long COVID?
Michelle, employers have had many questions related to COVID-19, long COVID, and their responsibilities under Title I of the ADA. The EEOC has another helpful resource when it comes to these topics, which has been continually updated as more was learned about COVID. Specific to your question, the guidance addresses when long COVID may be a disability under the ADA. The answer is the same as when any condition is determined to be a disability, whether it is temporary, long-term, or permanent. The answer is long COVID may rise to the level of being a disability under the ADA when a person's medical condition or any of its symptoms is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Long COVID is a physiological condition which can result in physical and mental impairments that impact major life activities like walking, breathing, concentrating, thinking, or interacting with others. The EEOC guidance also addresses topics such as the hiring process, providing reasonable accommodations, and returning to work.
Julie, we have many examples of reasonable accommodations to share today, so let's do a quick review of what a reasonable accommodation is and when it's required to be provided.
Michelle, under Title I of the ADA, covered employers are required to provide reasonable accommodation to qualified individuals with disabilities when needed to participate in the hiring process, perform the job, and enjoy the benefits and privileges of employment. Employers are required to provide reasonable accommodation at any point during the employment cycle, which includes when an employee who has not previously needed an accommodation now does due to acquiring a disability. A reasonable accommodation is a change in the customary way a work-related activity is accessed or performed to enable an individual with a disability to participate just as effectively in another way. When an employer reports a limitation accessing an environment or performing the job related to a disability or medical condition, the employer should consider this a request for a reasonable accommodation and begin the interactive process promptly. This is the informal process the employer engages in with the employee to work together to identify the work-related barrier, the disability-related limitation, and the effective solution. Remember, employees with disabilities often do not need accommodations at work, but when they do, accommodations can be low cost and simple to implement. Making sure employees have easy and efficient access to receiving reasonable accommodations can positively impact an employer's overall strategy to retain a qualified workforce.
Julie, I'm looking forward to talking about some of those reasonable accommodations shortly. Before we do, let's stop to answer questions. Just so everyone is aware, we did receive some pre-submitted questions with the registration. I'd also like to give the employers attending today a chance to interact with us. We'd like to hear from you about the strategies your workplace has implemented to help employees who have acquired a disability remain productive in their jobs. So we'd love it if you would share this with us by entering your answer into the Q&A box, and we'll read some of those during the break. So Julie, our first pre-submitted question is, do employers have to provide a reasonable accommodation for a limitation caused by pregnancy or menopause?
Thank you, Michelle. That is a common question that we receive, especially about pregnancy, is whether or not that's a disability and whether or not an employer is responsible for providing a reasonable accommodation. And so I'll just refer back to what we shared earlier in the presentation today, that there is not a list of conditions that automatically qualify a person as having a disability. So pregnancy and menopause themselves are not automatically considered a disability. However, during those conditions or any other temporary type of conditions, if something occurs that impacts a limitation or a symptom that rises to the level of substantially limiting a major life activity, then during that temporary period of time that that condition exists, it may rise to the level of being a disability, and that is when the employer would be responsible to provide a reasonable accommodation.
Thanks, Julie. And we have someone in the audience who shared that hybrid/remote work has been a valuable tool in supporting employees with disabilities. Thanks for sharing. Right. So thank you for answering that pre-submitted question, Julie, and thank you, audience, for sharing an example of how your workplace has assisted employees who've acquired a disability remain productively working. So we're going to take another break before we finish, so please post any more questions that you have in the Q&A box. So let's transition now to sharing examples of reasonable accommodations that can be effective in enabling employees who acquire disabilities to perform their job.
Michelle, we've discussed how a person may acquire a disability and that a disability may be temporary or long-term and could have periods of exacerbation and remission. We also shared that while the most common disability type is related to mobility, followed second by cognition, we know acquired disabilities can impact all disability types. The examples we share will address a variety of limitations in disabilities that are acquired through an accident or injury, and disabilities that are acquired through the onset of a medical condition or illness. We will also share examples of when a disability is temporary and when a disability may have periods of exacerbation. Just as a reminder, not all employees who acquire a disability need an accommodation in the workplace. However, when an accommodation is needed, the effective solution is always determined through a case-by-case analysis because each individual, each job, and each workplace is unique.
Julie, thank you for those helpful reminders. Okay, let's begin with disabilities acquired through an accident or injury and the reasonable accommodations that may be effective.
Michelle, an accident or injury can occur in both our professional and personal lives and can result in a disability that impacts hearing, seeing, communicating, and thinking, or could impact activities like walking, lifting, and using the hands and fingers for fine motor tasks. We will share examples relating to conditions that impact the head and spine, or that result in an amputation of a limb or a musculoskeletal disorder.
Julie, let's begin by discussing the limitations that may be present with a head injury. According to Johns Hopkins, one of the most common causes of disability in adults is head injuries. And these can be caused by motor vehicle accidents, falls, or violence.
Michelle, a head injury can be mild, like a bump or bruise, or can be moderate to severe and include a concussion or a brain injury. A severe injury could impact muscle strength, fine motor skills, vision, hearing, speech, thinking, memory, and behavior.
So Julie, this kind of injury could impact the workplace in a variety of ways. We have two scenarios with examples of accommodations modified from Jan and other resources.
Michelle, in the first example, an employee experienced a brain injury that resulted in difficulty reading past the midline of the document when reading from left to right. This caused a limitation with performing work on a computer. A couple of ideas were suggested. One was to change the margin settings in the application he was working in, so the content of the document remained on the left side of the computer. Another idea was to implement software that could split the computer screen. It would keep the content on the left side and black out the space on the right side. In the second example, a therapist whose head injury resulted in a limitation with memory and fine motor skills was having difficulty writing notes during client sessions and recalling later what was discussed. As an accommodation, the therapist was permitted to record the therapy sessions and then restructure her schedule to provide 15 minutes after each session to transfer the notes to her computer and make any necessary edits using the keyboard.
Julie, changing the margin settings and recording sessions instead of writing seem like easy solutions. Thank you for sharing. Our next category is spinal cord injuries. A spinal cord injury results from the damage to any part of the spinal cord or the nerves at the end of the spinal canal.
Michelle, some of the common causes include motor vehicle accidents, falls, violence, and sports and recreation activities. The resulting damage can be temporary or permanent and can impact the ability to feel, strength, movement, and body functions like breathing and bowel and bladder control. Paralysis from a spinal cord injury is called quadriplegia or tetraplegia when it affects the arms, hands, trunk, legs, and pelvic organs. It is called paraplegia when it impacts the lower body, pelvic organs, and legs.
Julie, this kind of injury could happen to anyone. It's great to know there are accommodations that can help when needed. Let's share some examples.
Michelle, the first example is about a florist who experienced an accident resulting in paraplegia and the use of a wheelchair. Her job required making flower arrangements, which customarily is performed at a standing height workstation. As an accommodation, her employer provided an adjustable height workstation so the florist could arrange flowers at the height that was most effective for her while using her wheelchair. The next example is an office employee with quadriplegia who required assistance with eating during lunch and managing personal needs on breaks. As an accommodation, the employer permitted the employee to have a personal assistant come to the workplace.
Julie, an adjustable height workstation is beneficial for a variety of needs, and some employers provide these to all employees who request them. Our next category to discuss that can result from an accident or injury is an amputation, which is the loss or absence of all or part of a limb. And this can be caused by trauma or an illness like diabetes.
Michelle, most lower limb amputations are due to vascular conditions, and most upper limb amputations are a result of an accident or trauma. An amputation of the lower limb can impact mobility, balance, and positional tolerances. An amputation of the upper limb can impact the handling and manipulating of items, maneuvering and transporting materials, and operating input devices at a computer workstation. With any type of amputation, there may be a need for time to learn to use a prosthetic device.
Julie, we have many ideas for accommodations to consider for upper and lower limb amputations that can be effective in enabling an individual to return to work.
Michelle, you are right. First, for lower extremity amputations, there are a variety of items and equipment to consider. To navigate stairs, installing a platform lift could be helpful. To maintain a stationary position at standing height, an adjustable height sit-stand stool could be considered. And for transporting items from one place to another, a lightweight cart or a power-operated cart could be useful. For upper extremity amputations, there are also many ideas. To increase access to a computer workstation, there are one-handed keyboards and mouse options like a trackball, head pointing systems, and a foot-operated mouse. For lifting and transporting materials, there are lifting hoists and scooters with carrying baskets. And for driving, there are modifications that can be made, like the addition of a steering knob. Or Jan shared an example of a truck driver who experienced an amputation of her dominant arm and was able to return to work when her employer provided her with a truck with an automatic transmission. One last idea I'll share is to consider leave or a flexible schedule. A person who experiences an amputation may obtain a prosthetic device and need to attend therapy appointments to become skilled in using the device.
Julie, a flexible schedule is another accommodation some employers provide for all because they realize the benefit of supporting employees in managing their work and personal lives. There are many reasons a person may need to flex their schedule, including for childcare, car repairs, personal appointments, and to manage a health condition. Okay, the last category we organized under disabilities that may result from an accident or injury are musculoskeletal disorders. These are also known as cumulative trauma disorders and include conditions like bursitis, carpal tunnel syndrome, tendinitis, and thoracic outlet syndrome.
Michelle, these conditions impact muscles, nerves, blood vessels, ligaments, and tendons, all the components that make up a joint like a shoulder, a wrist, a hip, or a knee. The cause is often participation in activities like lifting, bending, reaching, pushing, and pulling, and performing fine motor tasks repetitively. Other contributing factors include working in awkward postures and performing tasks with sudden, forceful exertion. These conditions can lead to pain and discomfort, lack of sensation or numbness, decreased joint movement, weakness, and decreased coordination. Musculoskeletal disorders are often associated with work injuries, and so much has been done to support employers in making changes to job tasks and the work environment as a prevention strategy. We'll share some resources for employers related to this later in the webinar.
Julie, these conditions can occur from leisure activities too. In fact, some of these are better known by their non-medical titles, like golfer's elbow and tennis elbow. Okay, let's talk about ideas for accommodations for these conditions.
Michelle, I have 3 scenarios to share from Jan to illustrate how work tasks can be performed just as effectively in another way. The first example is a maintenance worker who has a musculoskeletal disorder of the shoulder called rotator cuff syndrome. This caused a limitation with reaching certain areas to clean and moving cleaning supplies through the work environment. The employee was accommodated with cleaning tools that were lightweight, pneumatic, and had long handles. The employer also provided an electric cart the employee could use to transport supplies from place to place. The next example is an assembly line worker with bursitis in one knee, which limited standing for prolonged periods. To continue performing the job, the employee was provided an anti-fatigue mat to stand on, vibration dampening inserts for his shoes, and a stand lean stool that helped support his body weight as he leaned forward to perform work on the line. The final example is about a chef with carpal tunnel syndrome, which limited his ability to grasp items and manipulate tools, including the various knives used for cutting and chopping meat and vegetables. The solution was a set of ergonomic utensils and knives with a larger handle and of a heavier weight, requiring less force to utilize.
Julie, thank you for those great ideas and examples. Okay, let's now discuss disabilities that may be acquired through the onset of a medical condition or illness and the reasonable accommodations that may be effective.
Michelle, the onset of a medical condition or illness can occur to any of us during our lifetime, including during our working years. Just like with accidents and injuries, a medical condition or illness can result in a disability that impacts hearing, seeing, communicating, and thinking, or could impact activities like walking, lifting, and using the hands and fingers for fine motor tasks. Today, we are going to discuss disabilities that may result from conditions that impact the digestive, respiratory, endocrine, and cardiovascular systems.
Julie, sounds like a good plan. Let's start with the digestive system, which includes the esophagus, liver, stomach, intestines, gallbladder, and pancreas.
Michelle, this can include conditions like Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, gastroesophageal reflux disease, and irritable bowel syndrome. The symptoms and limitations a person may have as a result will vary and could range from mild to severe. These can include abdominal discomfort, nausea, frequent need to use the restroom, stress intolerance, and weight loss.
Julie, this is a category of disabilities we haven't really discussed before, so I'm looking forward to the ideas you have for ways to accommodate these conditions at work.
Michelle, when an employee makes a request for an accommodation related to a digestive disorder, it may be a sensitive topic. So remember to follow the best practices for navigating the interactive process. Keep the conversation focused on the work-related barrier, and remember to ask the employee what ideas they have for a solution, because often they know what is needed. The first example is an employee who, due to his digestive disorder, needs to access the restroom quickly at times. The simple fix for this was to relocate the employee's workstation to a location near the restroom. In the next scenario, an employer is hosting an annual holiday party and providing food for all employees. An employee with reflux disease is on a restricted diet. Because the employer's invitation to the party included their reasonable accommodation statement, the employee was able to easily make a request to have food options that would not trigger any sensitivities. As an accommodation, the employer agreed to work with the employee and the caterer to ensure there were food items on the menu the employee would be able to eat.
Julie, I'm sure this also benefited others that may have non-disclosed food sensitivities as well. Great idea. Next up is respiratory conditions. There are many conditions that fall under this category, which can impact the airway, lungs, and blood vessels.
Michelle, some of these conditions include asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, known as COPD, and fragrance sensitivity. The limitations associated with these can include difficulty breathing, fatigue, difficulty with mobility, heightened sensitivity to smells and scents, and compromised immunity to infection.
Julie, this includes a wide range of conditions and limitations. I'm sure you have some unique ideas to share for accommodations.
Michelle, I'll start with an idea for an employee with a disability that causes a heightened sensitivity to smells and scents. Jan offers some great guidance on implementing a fragrance-free work environment policy and ideas for accommodations. These include purchasing an air purifier to use at the workstation, permitting the employee to take breaks as needed for fresh air, and communicating to all employees to refrain from wearing heavy scents. Another example is an employee with COPD with a limitation in walking long distances due to the impact on breathing. The parking lot at her work location was large, and spaces were taken on a first-come, first-served basis. As an accommodation, the employer provided her a dedicated parking space close to the entrance of the building. One final example is an employee with asthma with a decreased tolerance to working in hot environments. Accommodation examples that were considered included providing the employee a fan for their work area and the ability to wear cooling products and clothing during their shift.
Julie, I've seen people wearing cooling products and clothing when they're doing yard work or exercising outdoors in the summer. What a great idea to utilize these tools at work as well. Okay, let's talk about the endocrine system. We sure are learning a lot today.
Michelle, the endocrine system is a complex network of glands and hormones that work to regulate functions like metabolism, energy levels, reproduction, growth and development, and responses to injuries and stress, and helps regulate our mood. Types of endocrine-related conditions include diabetes, hyperthyroidism, and Cushing's disease. The types of symptoms and limitations a person may experience can include fatigue, blurry vision, numbness of the hands or feet, cognitive limitations, difficulty sleeping, sensitivity to temperatures, muscle cramps, and weakness.
Julie, the endocrine system may be complex, but I bet you have some simple ideas for accommodations employers can consider.
Michelle, because the most common endocrine disorder is diabetes, I'm going to focus on this condition and particularly type 2 because this accounts for 90 to 95% of all cases and is a condition that is customarily acquired during the adult years. It's also a condition that can have an impact on a variety of bodily functions. Cognitive abilities like memory and time management may be affected. So some workplace accommodations could include providing reminders, using day planners or digital organizers, and providing a list of prioritized task assignments. At times, vision can be affected by diabetes and result in low vision or blindness. Accommodations will be unique to the employee's needs and the job tasks they perform. Some ideas include the use of magnifying devices and software, providing screen reading software and training on how to use, and modifying a policy to permit the use of a service animal for navigating the workspace. Diabetes often requires management through medications and dietary guidelines. To manage these, an employee may benefit from a flexible break schedule to take medications with food and drink as needed.
Julie, we have a helpful fact sheet for employers who have questions about integrating a service animal into the workplace, and we can drop that into the Q&A box here. This is also located in our Inclusive Employer Toolkit on the Employers page of the OOD website. Okay, let's discuss the final category we have for required conditions, the cardiovascular system.
Michelle, the cardiovascular system is made up of the heart and an intricate network of blood vessels. This system ensures our bodies get the things we need, like oxygen and nutrients, and it removes the waste materials we don't need. Conditions associated with the cardiovascular system include heart attack, stroke, abnormal heart rhythms known as arrhythmias, and aneurysms. The impact of these can include muscular weakness, decreased endurance, limitations with breathing, partial paralysis, and difficulty communicating.
Julie, what are some ways employers can accommodate the limitations that may result from these conditions?
Michelle, one common limitation an employee with a cardiovascular condition may experience is decreased endurance or fatigue. Depending on the situation, some helpful accommodations can be to permit telework, provide a flexible schedule, minimize physical exertion, and make ergonomic changes to the job. In an example from Jan, a receiving clerk with a heart condition had a limitation with performing strenuous activities. Her job included retrieving products at various heights to fulfill orders. As an accommodation, the employer provided an adjustable lift to retrieve the items positioned at an elevated height. This minimized the exertion required to perform the work task and enabled the employee to perform the task effectively. In another example from Jan, a teacher experienced a stroke that resulted in weakness and a decreased ability to move the left side of her body. This made it difficult for the teacher to stand, walk, balance, and perform grasping and fine motor tasks. To perform her work effectively, the employer provided her with a variety of accommodations, including low-tech grip aids for writing and grab bars placed along the walls of the classroom and hallways to assist with balancing while navigating the workspace.
Julie, I know we've packed a lot of great information into this section for accommodations, and you have two more unique considerations you'd like to share. The first is about providing solutions for employees whose disability has periods of exacerbation and periods of remission.
Michelle, there are many disabilities that can cause an employee to experience symptoms or limitations episodically, which mean these come and go and are not always present. One example is Meniere's disease. This is a condition that involves a buildup of fluid in the inner ear and can result in limitations with hearing and balance. Some of the symptoms that may come and go include ringing in the ears, hearing loss, dizziness, and migraine headaches. These symptoms may come on suddenly. It's helpful for employers to know that some accommodations are needed quickly and at certain times, but may not be needed all the time. Also, more than one accommodation may be needed. For example, an employee may benefit from a private office with minimal background noise during a flare-up that causes a limitation with hearing. And this same employee may benefit from a flexible schedule to leave work and go home when a migraine is coming on.
Julie, I think that it's very helpful to know that accommodations may be needed sometimes, but not others. And at times, more than one accommodation may be needed. Let's talk about temporary accommodations.
Michelle, we touched on this a bit earlier. Some conditions may rise to the level of being a disability under the ADA when an employee experiences a substantial limitation with a major life activity, even when it's a temporary condition. This may occur with employees who experience long-term effects from having COVID-19. For some, these can last for weeks, months, or longer. Long COVID can impact a variety of body systems, including the heart, lungs, kidneys, and brain. Jan offers a resource called Temporary or Trial Accommodations that offers best practices for employers to consider when providing temporary accommodations. This includes making sure the documentation approving the accommodation indicates the accommodation is being provided on a temporary basis, includes the beginning and ending date of the accommodation, addresses who will monitor the accommodation, and indicates what steps will be taken at the end of the temporary period. Jan shares an example of an employee with shortness of breath related to the condition of long COVID. His symptoms worsened with fatigue and stress. The employer permitted the employee to work in a hybrid fashion and, when in the office, permitted the employee to take rest breaks as needed. The documentation stated the accommodation was being provided temporarily and would be revisited on a specific date to determine if the accommodation was still needed.
Julie, it sounds like the key to implementing temporary accommodations is to document the details. Good idea. Okay, with the time we have left, we'd like to share some resources for employers who are working to foster a workplace culture that is inclusive of employees who acquire a disability.
Michelle, retaining a qualified workforce has always been important, but maybe now more so with the labor shortage many employers are experiencing. As we've highlighted today, at times a qualified and tenured employee may experience an injury, an accident, or the onset of a medical condition and need an accommodation to continue accessing the workplace and performing the job. We have some resources to help employers retain this valuable talent and provide employees what they need to remain on the job.
Julie, many employers are implementing stay at work and return to work programs as an effective strategy to retain employees and to positively impact productivity. These involve coordinating efforts and services to assist employees who experience an illness or injury to effectively keep working or to return to work as soon as possible.
Michelle, as we know from today's webinar, what employees may need to stay at work or return to work are reasonable accommodations, which may be temporary, as needed, or long-term. Because these situations may involve more than one employment law, Jan offers a resource that references the ADA, FMLA, which is the Family and Medical Leave Act, and workers' compensation laws. This resource also highlights the benefits of stay at work and return to work programs and includes best practices to create and maintain these. EARN also offers helpful information through their resource called Retain, which discusses applicable laws, strategies for retention, ways to foster an inclusive workplace, and how to measure progress.
Julie, there are 2 state agencies in Ohio that offer wonderful programs and services to employers to assist with staying at work, returning to work, and providing accommodations. The first is our sister agency, Ohio Bureau of Workers' Compensation, also known as the BWC.
Michelle, BWC offers many helpful resources, and I'd like to share a few that complement our 2-part webinar series on retaining qualified employees with disabilities. The first is a resource called Older Workers Safety, which includes safety tips and accident prevention for older workers. This resource identifies common problems that cause injuries like falls, lighting, and lifting, and offers safety tips for prevention, like installing color strips on the edge of each step, providing well-lit work areas, and educating on proper lifting techniques. BWC offers ergonomics tools and resources, including a risk factor assessment for cumulative trauma disorders, an ergonomic task analysis form, lifting guidelines, and resources for assessing and properly setting up a computer workstation. BWC has ergonomics consultants who provide services to reduce the potential for work-related injuries. These include operational assessments to identify hazards and develop improvements, project facilitation to help implement ergonomics projects, and return to work consultation to help identify modifications that may facilitate a successful return to work for an employee with an injury. One last resource I'll share from BWC is their Ergonomics Resource Guide by Industry. These are helpful because while there may be some commonalities amongst various workplaces, we know each employer and each work environment is unique. The ergonomics needs of a warehouse employee are going to be different than the needs of a nurse performing patient transfers. So this is an excellent resource for employers to review for their specific needs.
Julie, the second state agency we'd like to share is our very own Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities. The services OOD provides to Ohioans with disabilities applies to both finding and keeping a job. When an employer has an employee who has acquired a disability and can benefit from OOD's vocational rehabilitation services to keep their job, we encourage them to apply for these no-cost services. Here's how you can help as their employer. Sometimes when an employee with a disability, including an employee who acquires a disability, requests a reasonable accommodation, neither the individual nor the employer are sure of what the effective solution is. In that case, OOD may be able to help. During the interactive process, you can mention our services to the employee. Now, these services are confidential, so the employer cannot apply on behalf of the employee or ask the employee whether they've applied. But employers can share this as an option for the employee to consider to assist with identifying an effective solution to remain working. More information about our services is available at www.oodworks.com. And with that, let's take our final break to see what additional questions have come in. And we have an additional accommodation that is provided by a workplace. So those include cubicle screens, additional remote time, use of nursing pod as a quiet place for migraines, and moving cubicles. And our pre-submitted questions, we have a few. So the first is, due to confidentiality, I cannot disclose client's disability, and many employers do not recognize when it may be a mental health disability. How can you help employers who think someone with schizophrenia needs anger management rather than finding a way to lessen frustrations on the job?
Thank you for that question, Michelle. The way that we help support employers is through the education that we provide on how to create an inclusive workplace and also how to navigate responsibilities under Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so in that, we educate employers that they are able to determine their jobs and the productivity expectations of their jobs. They're able to establish rules of conduct and expectations for that conduct. And any enforcement of that. And so in that, when an employer notices that any employee is not performing up to these expectation levels, or maybe maybe there's some misconduct that's being noticed, we recommend that the employer have the conversation with the employee that they would, with all employees, keep that conversation the same, focus the conversation on what the performance expectation or what the conduct rule is, and clearly point out to the employee where they're maybe not meeting the expectation, and then ask how they can help as the employer. If in that response, as the employer, hear some information that relates to a barrier in the work environment and a medical condition or a disability, that is a request for an accommodation. It can be that subtle. And so the way that we educate employers is to then be aware of that and refer the person to the appropriate contact in human resources to talk about that further to determine if there is an effective accommodation available. And we also talk with employers about best practices for applying the consequences for low performance and misconduct, and when maybe to pause that during the interactive process to determine if an effective, reasonable accommodation will help the person to meet the measure. So that's how we approach employers, is just through that education to support them in these situations.
Thanks, Julie. Next question is, how do you determine that the degree of performance will not be affected?
Thank you, Michelle. So since this is a pre-submitted question, I'm going to assume that we mean, how do we determine the degree of performance will not be affected through the use of a reasonable accommodation? And so the intention of the reasonable accommodation is to enable the employee to perform the job's essential functions to their expected productivity levels. I will say, and sometimes an accommodation can be fairly simple to identify and implement, and you know that it will achieve that goal. But at other times, we're not sure if a reasonable accommodation will be effective until we try it. And so while we talked about providing temporary accommodations, you can also provide trial accommodations so the accommodation can be used in the work environment to see if it will be effective. What would be helpful in that situation is when you approve that accommodation to document, similar to how we discussed with temporary accommodations, document that it's a trial period of time, provide the dates for that, and then indicate what will happen if the accommodation is not effective, which customarily means you revisit that interactive process and you look for another option to consider.
Thanks, Julie. And our final question is, what focus, if any, is given to or for disabled veterans?
Thank you, Michelle. So in our research for today's webinar and delivery, we did not focus on veterans as a group, but certainly this is a group of individuals that may encounter a situation that leads to the onset of a medical condition or illness, or may experience an accident or injury that results in a disability. And so just like with all groups, this may impact a person during their working years. And while they did not need an accommodation at one point, they might now. And so all the practices that we talked about today really support veterans as well who may be experiencing a disability, and to create the inclusive workplace culture where veterans also feel comfortable to ask for what they need to continue working.
Thanks, Julie. And thank you everyone for your questions. So that brings us to the end of today's webinar. Julie, what closing thoughts do you have?
Michelle, millions of American workers experience an injury or illness, which has the potential to impact work. Often what is needed to successfully stay at work or return to work is a reasonable accommodation. Employers who cultivate inclusive workplaces and collaborate with employees to implement successful accommodations can avoid turnover costs, maintain and enhance productivity, and most importantly, retain a valuable and talented workforce. I hope the examples we shared today convey the many ways reasonable accommodations can enable employers to retain a qualified workforce. Remember, OOD is here to help. If you have questions or goals related to hiring, retaining, and advancing employees with disabilities, please contact us.